My name is Demi Allen, and at 29 years old, I'm a captain in the United States Army. But on my wedding day, none of that mattered. In front of 280 guests, CEOs, generals, Army Rangers, and my father's entire board of directors, he slapped me. The sound cracked through the cathedral as he pointed at my uniform and roared, "Take off those silly pieces of metal." He was talking about the Bronze Star, the one I earned in Kandahar. It was his final wedding gift to me, a public humiliation. He thought he'd won, that I would crumble like I always had. But he made one fatal mistake. He did it in front of my real family. Before I tell my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that honor can't be bought and that resilience is the greatest legacy of all. The sound didn't just happen, it bloomed. A sharp, violent crack that ripped through the organ's final trembling note and devoured all the air in St. Michael's Cathedral. For a moment, it felt like the world had been hollowed out, leaving only the ringing in my ears and the faint, low hum of the industrial-grade air conditioning system somewhere high above the vaulted ceilings. I didn't feel the pain. Not on my cheek. My training, the years spent learning to compartmentalize, to operate through chaos, took over. My body registered the impact, my head turning with the force of the blow, but my mind detached. It became a camera, recording the scene with a cold, pristine clarity. I saw everything. The stained glass window behind the altar depicted the Archangel Michael casting down a dragon. Sunlight streamed through it, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sudden, suffocating silence. I saw my older brother, David, standing in the front pew. He wasn't shocked. On his face was a flicker of something ugly and triumphant, a smug satisfaction that twisted his handsome features. He looked like a man who had just seen a risky stock bet pay off. I saw the CEOs my father had invited, men who moved markets with a single phone call, now frozen in their pews, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and alarm. They weren't looking at me, they were looking at my father, Richard Allen, as if he were a volatile asset they suddenly needed to divest from. And then I saw my family, the real one. The generals, the colonels, and the sergeants scattered amongst the guests. Their faces were granite. I saw General Peters, a man who had seen the worst of humanity in Fallujah, whose eyes went from disbelief to a quiet, controlled fury that was far more terrifying than any shouting. I saw the young Rangers who had served with my fiancé, Mark, their bodies instinctively straightening, their hands uncurling from their programs as if preparing for a command. They were a sea of quiet, lethal stillness in an ocean of chaos. My father stood before me, his chest heaving, the faint, cloying scent of expensive whiskey. Macallan 18, his signature, wafted from him. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed with the exertion of his rage. He looked powerful, dominant, a monument to his own authority. He truly believed, in that moment, that he had finally extinguished the last flicker of rebellion in me. He believed he had won. He was wrong. Before anyone could move, before the first shocked gasp could turn into a word, he leaned in close. The whiskey on his breath was a furnace blast against my skin. His voice was no longer a roar for the public. It was a low, venomous hiss, meant only for me, a final twist of the knife. "You've embarrassed me for the last time, you little bitch," he rasped, the words like acid in my ear. "You are no daughter of mine." That hurt more than the slap. The slap was a physical act, a temporary violation. But those words were a verdict. They were the final, brutal severing of a cord that had been fraying for 29 years. It wasn't just anger, it was a formal, cruel disownment, delivered at the altar where he was supposed to give me away. A final entry in the Allen family ledger, writing me off as a total loss. But the silence was broken not by another shout, but by movement. Precise, economical, and silent. "Mark!" He didn't yell. He didn't charge. He moved with the fluid efficiency of a man trained for war, a man whose every motion had a purpose. He didn't lay a hand on my father. He didn't need to. Instead, he took 2 steps forward and simply placed himself between me and Richard Allen. A human shield, a living boundary. He didn't look at me. His eyes, cold and steady, were locked on my father's. That simple, unwavering stare held more menace than any shouted threat ever could. It was the look of a predator assessing a threat. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father flinch. Then Mark turned his head slightly, his gaze softening as it fell on me. His voice was calm, clear, and just loud enough for the first few rows to hear, cutting through the thick, tense air. "Captain," he said, and the use of my rank was a deliberate, powerful choice. "Do you require medical assistance?" He wasn't asking his bride if she was okay. He was asking an officer if she was injured. He was reframing the entire event, pulling it out of the messy, complicated world of family dysfunction and placing it squarely into the black and white world of military conduct. My father's face contorted, rage returning as his confidence faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, to reassert the dominance that had just been so quietly challenged. He never got the chance. Mark raised a hand, not aggressively, but as a simple, undeniable gesture to stop. It was the motion of a man in complete control. And when he spoke again, his voice was different. The warmth of the concerned fiancé was gone, replaced by the crisp, formal tone of an officer reporting an incident. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the cathedral. "Please remain calm. An assault on a commissioned officer of the United States Army has just occurred." A collective, audible gasp swept through the church. "I'm going to ask you to please remain in your seats." With those words, the world shifted on its axis. He had done it. He had changed the game entirely. St. Michael's was no longer a church. It was a potential crime scene. The 280 guests were no longer attendees. They were witnesses. And my father, Richard Allen, the titan of industry, the king of his own empire, was no longer a father disciplining his daughter. He was a perpetrator. Time has a strange way of stretching and compressing in a crisis. In the ringing silence of St. Michael's, a single second felt like an eternity. Mark's words, "An assault on a commissioned officer has just occurred," hung in the air, shimmering and dangerous. They had created a new reality. And in the space between the old one and the new, my mind didn't stay in the present. It fled. It raced backward, searching for a beginning to this ending, trying to trace the fault line that had led to this earthquake, and it found one. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a quiet, recurring ritual that was as much a part of my family's tradition as turkey and pumpkin pie on Thanksgiving. In the Allen household, Thanksgiving was never just about gratitude. It was a corporate event disguised as a family holiday. The day was filled with the rich smells of my mother's roast turkey and sage stuffing, the clinking of heavy silverware against fine china, and the murmur of polite conversation. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of tension, a quiet anticipation for what we all knew was coming. The main event wasn't the meal, it was the audit. After the last slice of pie had been served and the coffee was poured, my father would clear his throat, silencing the table. He would then retreat to his study and return holding a large, heavy book. It was bound in dark green leather with the Allen Ledger embossed in gold leaf on the cover. It looked ancient and important, like a sacred text. And in our family, it was. He would place it at the head of the table with a soft, authoritative thud. Opening it, he would put on his reading glasses and begin the year-end review. He'd start with David, my oldest brother. "David," he'd announce, his voice booming with pride. "A successful year. The logistics contract with Petrocorp. A net gain of $2 million for the company." He would uncap his expensive fountain pen, and we would all listen to the scratch of the nib on the thick, creamy paper as he wrote the number down. A round of applause, led by my father, would follow. David would nod, accepting it as his due. Then, Michael. Michael. The downtown residential project. Efficient management, brought in under budget. A value of $800,000. Another scratch of the pen, another round of polite, obligatory applause. My brothers, basking in the warm glow of their calculated worth. For years, I had no entry. I was just a child, a line item with no profit attached. But I dreaded the day my turn would come. That day arrived when I was 17. I had spent 6 months of my junior year of high school working on a project for the Texas statewide science fair. It was a structural engineering analysis, a new method for testing the load-bearing capacity of composite building materials. It was complex, it was innovative, and it won. First place in the state. I was bursting with pride. For the first time, I felt I had something to bring to the Thanksgiving table, something that, in its own way, connected to the world of construction my father ruled. When it was my turn, I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I presented my project, explaining the methodology, the potential applications. My father listened, nodding slowly, a neutral expression on his face that I desperately wanted to interpret as approval. When I finished, the family offered a hesitant, scattered applause. My father looked at me for a long moment. Then he opened the ledger to my page. He wrote down the name of my project in his neat, decisive script. He moved his pen to the final column, the one that mattered. He paused for dramatic effect, then wrote a large, bold, unmistakable figure, 0. He looked up, meeting my eyes over the rim of his glasses, and addressed the table, though his words were aimed directly at me. If it doesn't sell, he declared, his voice cold and didactic, it has no value. An important lesson, Demi. The humiliation was a physical thing. It felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. I sat down, my face burning, and stared at my empty dessert plate, blinking back tears. I didn't hear what was said after that. The world had gone silent, just as it did in the church all those years later. That night, my mother came into my room. She didn't hug me or offer comforting words. She rarely did. Her method was quieter, more subtle. She sat on the edge of my bed and told me a story I'd never heard before. Before I married your father, she said, her voice soft, I owned a small flower shop. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I loved it. She explained that when they got engaged, Richard had convinced her to sell it. To focus on the family. But the truth, she said, was that he couldn't stand her having something that was hers, something he didn't own or control. She took my hand, her fingers cool and gentle around mine. Don't let him buy your soul, Demi, she whispered, her eyes filled with a sad, fierce urgency. It's worth more than all the numbers in that book. A few years later, she was gone, taken by a cancer that was as relentless as my father. But she left me with her only inheritance, that quiet act of resistance. My brothers, however, had inherited my father's cruelty. They were his enthusiastic enforcers. Throughout my childhood, they mocked my interests. The books I read were useless. My dream of being an engineer was a childish phase. They treated me not like a sister, but like a strange, unprofitable division of the family business. When I finally announced my decision to enlist in the army, it was David who sealed my fate with my father. I overheard him one night, his voice dripping with condescension. Just let her go, Dad, he'd said. She's a lost cause anyway. At least in the army, she'll finally learn how to follow an order. A failed investment. That's all I was to them. And now, standing at the altar in St. Michael's, the ghost of that 17-year-old girl rising inside me, I finally understood. The slap, the words, the public humiliation. It wasn't a new attack. It was just the final logical entry in a ledger that had been written long ago. My father had his leather-bound book filled with numbers. His entire world was defined by it. I looked down at my dress uniform, at the rows of ribbons over my heart. My eyes settled on the cold, hard metal of the Bronze Star. For valor, for merit, for a value that could never be bought or sold. This, I thought, a strange calm settling over me. This was my ledger. A ledger is filled one line at a time. My father filled his with dollar signs. I decided to fill mine with action. The day I enlisted, I made a clean break. I cut off the trust fund, refused the allowance, and walked away from the Allen empire with nothing but a duffel bag and a burning need to prove that my mother's faith in me and my own quiet belief in myself was worth more than 0 to 0. The price of that freedom was steep. Those first few years were a lesson in brutal humility. While my brothers were upgrading their Porsches, I was learning to budget a second lieutenant's salary. I found a tiny rundown apartment just outside the main gate of Fort Hood, Texas. The rent was cheap for a reason. That first winter, a cold snap hit Central Texas, and the ancient heater in my unit gave up with a final, rattling sigh. I didn't have the few $100s for the emergency repair. So, I slept in my sweats, my fleece jacket, and piled the two thin Army-issue blankets on top of me. Lying there in the freezing dark, I could almost feel the cold seeping into my bones, but it didn't break me. It forged me. Every shiver was a reminder that I was on my own. I was paying my dues. And I was more than willing to pay. That forging process was personified by one man, Drill Sergeant Barnes. He was a senior NCO, an African-American man from rural Louisiana who had spent 20 years in the infantry and had the deep etched lines on his face to prove it. He knew exactly who I was from day one. He'd read my file. He saw Richard Allen on the next of kin line and the dollar signs that came with it. I could see the question in his eyes. How long would the princess last? He made it his personal mission to find out. He singled me out for the toughest tasks. I led the longest ruck marches. I plotted the most complex land navigation courses. I was always the first one chosen to demonstrate hand-to-hand combat techniques. He rode me harder than anyone else in my officer candidate school class. It wasn't hazing. It was a test. A crucible. The breaking point came during a field training exercise. We had been on the move for nearly 36 hours with no sleep, running drills on minimal food and water. Exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, making my eyelids feel like lead. I was stumbling, my vision blurring at the edges. I felt my knees start to buckle. Just as I was about to go down, Barnes was there, his shadow falling over me. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a canteen. He just stood there and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Pain is temporary, Captain," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "But honor is forever." He wasn't tormenting me. He was teaching me. He was showing me that my last name meant nothing here. The Allen ledger had no value. Out here, the only currency was grit. I took a deep breath, pushed myself back to my full height, and kept moving. I passed his test. After my first deployment to Iraq, I was promoted to first lieutenant. I had earned it. I had led soldiers in a combat zone and brought them all home. In a moment of naive hope, I decided to write a letter to my father. It wasn't to gloat or to show off. It was a genuine attempt to explain, to bridge the chasm between our worlds. I filled 4 pages, telling him about my soldiers, about the weight of responsibility, about learning what it meant to build a legacy not of buildings, but of people. I sealed it in an envelope and sent it to his corporate headquarters in Dallas. I told myself not to expect a reply, and I was right. 2 weeks later, a crisp, professional-looking envelope from Allen Industries arrived in my mail in Baghdad. It felt heavy. I remember my hands trembling slightly as I opened it, a foolish part of me hoping for a note, a sign, anything. Inside, there was no letter. There was only my own 4-page letter, torn neatly into 4 equal squares. A silent, brutal, unmistakable message. He hadn't just rejected my words. He had negated my entire experience. If you've ever poured your heart out to someone, ever tried to make them understand your world, only to have it dismissed and thrown back in your face, I need you to do 2 things for me right now. First, hit that like button just to show you're here with me. Second, just comment with the single word, honor, below. It's a small word, but it means everything. It's what they can't take from us. That torn letter was the last time I ever tried to seek his approval. I closed that account. From then on, my work was for me and for the soldiers I served with. And in Kandahar, Afghanistan, I finally understood the true nature of what I was building. My platoon was on patrol when the world exploded. A well-coordinated ambush erupted from a series of mud brick compounds. RPGs, machine gun fire. It was chaos. In the initial blast, a young private, no older than 19, was hit in the leg. He was exposed, trapped in the middle of the kill zone. Without a second thought, I moved. I laid down covering fire while my sergeant coordinated the response, and I ran to the private. I grabbed him by his body armor and dragged him, yard by painful yard, back to the relative safety of an armored vehicle. The fight was over in 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. After the smoke cleared and the medevac was on its way, the young private grabbed my hand. His face was pale with pain and shock, but his eyes were clear. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his grip surprisingly strong. "I will follow you anywhere." And in that moment, I saw it all with perfect clarity. My father built skyscrapers out of concrete and steel, monuments to commerce that scraped the sky. They were impressive, they were valuable, but they were hollow. I was building something else entirely. Out here, in the dust and blood of a forgotten war, I was building bonds of loyalty. I was building an empire of trust. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that what I was building would last so much longer. In my father's world, trust was a contract, a legal document with clauses and consequences, underwritten by money. In my new world, trust was a currency earned in moments of extreme pressure. It wasn't written down, it was demonstrated. And I met the man I would marry in the place where that currency was traded most dearly. His name was Mark, and I met him in a tactical operations center at Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan. The room smelled of dust, stale coffee, and the faint, sharp tang of jet fuel that clung to everything. It was a place of controlled chaos, but at that moment, it was my stage. As an intelligence officer, I was briefing a group of senior officers and team leaders on an upcoming mission. My part of the brief was a warning. I had found a discrepancy in the intel, a subtle but significant flaw in the satellite imagery analysis that suggested a planned route for a team of Army Rangers was not clear, but was, in fact, the likely site of a complex ambush. I laid out my case, pointing to shadows that didn't belong and heat signatures that were too recent. The reaction was dismissal. A full-bird colonel, eager to keep the mission on schedule, waved a hand dismissively. "It's thin, Captain. You're being overly cautious." Others nodded in agreement. I felt that old, familiar sting of being brushed aside, my careful work invalidated. I was about to stand down when a voice cut through the murmuring. "I'll take thin." Every head turned. Standing near the back of the room was a captain I didn't recognize, tall and lean, with the quiet, coiled intensity that marked him as Special Forces. He was the leader of the Ranger team in question. He stepped forward. "I trust Captain Allen's assessment," he said, his voice calm and even. "My team doesn't move until we verify." The room went silent. He had just publicly contradicted a full-bird colonel and put his mission on hold, all based on the word of an intel officer he'd never met. He wasn't just listening to me. He was betting his men's lives on my judgment. In that moment, he signed a contract with me, one written not in ink, but in absolute, unconditional trust. He saw me not as a woman, not as a name, but as a professional. It was the most profound form of respect I had ever received. Our first date, a week later, wasn't exactly romantic. It was in the main dining facility at Bagram, under the buzz of fluorescent lights, over plates of dry chicken and lumpy mashed potatoes. But the setting didn't matter. He didn't ask about my family, where I went to college, or what my father did for a living. The usual checklist of a man trying to size up a woman's pedigree. Instead, he looked at me and asked, "What's the hardest command decision you've ever had to make?" I was taken aback. I told him about a firefight in Iraq, about having to make the call to abandon a piece of expensive surveillance equipment to prioritize the evacuation of a wounded soldier. It was a choice that had earned me a reprimand for the loss of government property. He listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he just nodded slowly. "You chose people over gear," he said. "That's the mark of a good leader." No one had ever called me that before. In my family, choosing people over assets was a sign of a bad investment. With one simple sentence, Mark had taken what my father's world saw as a weakness and reframed it as my greatest strength. I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the lukewarm coffee in my cup. When we both returned to the States, our relationship deepened, away from the dust and danger of Afghanistan. One weekend, he took me hiking along the Barton Creek Greenbelt in Austin. We climbed up to a rocky outcrop overlooking the Colorado River, the late afternoon sun turning the water to gold. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't pull out a diamond ring. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out two blank military-issue dog tags. They were simple, silver, and felt cool and heavy in my palm. He held one up. "On these," he said, "they stamp your name, your blood type, your religion. It's what the Army needs to know to identify your body." His expression was serious, but his eyes were incredibly soft. "But I want to know what you stand for. I want to know your vow." He handed me one of the blank tags. "What will you etch onto your life, Demi?" It wasn't a proposal of marriage. It was a proposal of partnership, an invitation to build a shared legacy, a contract based not on assets, but on values. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for me. I told him I would etch the word honor onto mine. He said he would etch loyalty. Before we made it official, I knew I had to do the one thing I was dreading: take him to meet my father. We met for a tense, awkward lunch at a steakhouse in Dallas that smelled of leather and money. Richard sized Mark up the way he would a potential business acquisition. He asked about his salary, his prospects, his family's net worth. When he learned Mark was also career military, a soldier who owned little more than his truck and his gear, my father leaned back and smirked. "Well," he said, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin, "I suppose it's good my daughter found someone who shares her hobby of playing war. That's fine. But when you two are ready to build something real, you come and see me." Mark didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He just met my father's condescending gaze with a look of calm, unwavering confidence. "We're already building something, sir," Mark replied, his voice level and respectful, yet utterly defiant. "A life." My father was speechless. For the first time, someone had stood up to him, not by challenging his power, but by simply refusing to play his game. Mark's self-worth wasn't tied to a number in a ledger, so my father had no leverage, no way to control him. On the car ride home, I was quiet, the encounter leaving a sour taste in my mouth. Mark reached over and took my hand. He pulled an old brass compass from his pocket and placed it in my palm. It was worn, the edges smooth from use. "I was going to give you this later," he said. "For you. Because you always know the way home, no matter where home is." He paused, then looked at me, his eyes seeing right through the armor I'd spent a lifetime building. "You don't need his empire, Demi," he said, his voice firm and certain. "You are an empire." The weeks following my engagement were a rare period of calm. For the first time, I felt like I was building a life on my own terms, a life Mark's words had given me the courage to claim, my own empire. But empires are never left unchallenged. The old world, the one I had fought so hard to escape, came calling. And it came with the one weapon I was least prepared for, the illusion of peace. The first move was a phone call from my eldest brother, David. It came 2 weeks before the wedding date. I hadn't spoken to him in months, and his name flashing on my screen sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I let it go to voicemail, but he called back immediately. I finally answered, my guard already up. His voice was like honey laced with arsenic, sickeningly sweet and entirely fake. "Demi, sweetheart, how are you?" he began, the picture of a concerned older brother. "Listen, Dad, he just wants what's best for you. He's just so proud, you know. He wants his little girl to look like a princess on her big day." I stayed silent, letting him spin his web. "He went out and picked a dress for you," David continued, his voice oozing with false sincerity. "A Vera Wang. Absolutely stunning. He just wants to see you happy, Demi." There it was, the opening salvo. Not a demand, but a gift. A Trojan horse made of silk and lace. I knew what it really was, a test of loyalty. A uniform for his side of the conflict. "That's very generous, David," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "But I've already chosen what I'm wearing." The honey vanished from his voice, replaced by the cold, hard tone of a businessman closing a deal. "Look, just compromise a little, Demi. Wear the dress, be nice to Dad at the church. maybe even apologize for, you know, the misunderstanding. He'll forgive you. He's even set aside a seven-figure check as a wedding gift. Just think of it as a business transaction. A small concession for a big payout, it's a good deal. A business transaction, my dignity, my identity, my self-respect, all just commodities to be traded for peace and a fat check. The rage was a cold knot in my stomach. My wedding is not a business deal, David, I said, my voice low and final. And I'm not for sale. I hung up before he could respond. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next day, a text message arrived from David. It wasn't words, it was a picture. An old photograph of my mother, smiling, her arm around a much younger me. She looked so happy, so full of life. The caption below it read, "She would have wanted this. She would have wanted her family to be together and happy on your special day." That was the moment the nausea hit me. It was a physical revulsion, a sickness that started in my gut and rose to my throat. They were using her memory as a weapon. They were taking the purest thing I had left of her and twisting it into a tool for emotional blackmail. In the Allen family, even the dead were assets to be leveraged. I finally saw the true depth of the toxicity, how it poisoned everything it touched, even memory, even love. And still, they didn't stop. Despite my refusal, the package arrived the next day. A box so enormous it barely fit through my apartment door, emblazoned with the iconic, elegant script, Vera Wang. It wasn't a gift, it was a power move. It was my father declaring that my wishes were irrelevant. His will would be done. I opened the box. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a dress of breathtaking beauty. A cascade of ivory silk and intricate lace, a gown fit for royalty. It was the kind of dress little girls dream of. But as I looked at it, I didn't see a dream. I saw a prison. I saw a uniform of surrender, a costume I was meant to wear to play the part of the dutiful daughter. I looked from the dress to my own uniform, hanging crisp and proud on the back of my bedroom door. The deep blue of the Army service uniform, the polished brass of the buttons, the neat rows of ribbons telling the story of my life, my sacrifices, my honor. The choice had never been clearer. One was a costume. The other was my skin. The next morning, I carefully repacked the Vera Wang gown into its magnificent box. I didn't rip it. I didn't deface it. That would have been an emotional reaction, and this was now a strategic operation. I drove it across town to a small nonprofit I knew of, a place called Brides Across America. They provide wedding dresses, free of charge, to military brides, servicewomen or the spouses of servicemen who can't afford them. I carried the heavy box inside. The woman at the counter looked at me, then at the box, her eyes wide. "I'd like to donate this," I said simply, anonymously. She was speechless for a moment, then nodded, a look of profound gratitude on her face. As I was about to leave, I took a small note card from my purse and placed it on top of the box. I had written it last night, the words coming to me with absolute clarity. It read, "For a woman who understands that strength is more beautiful than silk." As I walked out into the sunshine, I felt a sense of release. I hadn't just gotten rid of a dress. I had taken a symbol of my father's oppression and transformed it into a gift of solidarity. I had redefined its value on my own terms. The war for my wedding day had begun, and I had just fired the first, silent shot. In the military, the hours before a major operation are a strange mix of calm and tension. There's a quiet focus, a sense of shared purpose that hangs in the air. That's what the night before my wedding felt like. There was no bachelorette party with silly games and pink sashes. That wasn't my world. My world, my real family, gathered in the backyard of the small house Mark and I were renting. We sat around a crackling bonfire, the Texas sky dark and sprinkled with stars above us. It was just our inner circle, my two escorts for the wedding, both Rangers from Mark's unit, a tough-as-nails female Apache helicopter pilot I'd served with in Iraq, and a few others from our tight-knit community. The air smelled of mesquite wood smoke and damp earth. We passed around bottles of Shiner Bock, the iconic Texas beer, its dark amber glass cool against our palms. No one talked about the wedding. No one mentioned my father or the Vera Wang dress. Instead, we did what soldiers do. We told old stories. We ribbed each other mercilessly about past mistakes. A botched training exercise, a terrible haircut, a disastrous blind date. We laughed. It was a language of its own, a way of building a perimeter of support without ever saying the words. It was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that a significant operation was scheduled for the morning, and they were all on my fire team. Their presence wasn't just a comfort, it was a fortification. When the last of them had finally left, their truck taillights disappearing down the dark country road, Mark and I stood by the dying embers of the fire. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. He didn't ask if I was scared. A good commander never asks a soldier a question they already know the answer to. He knew. Instead, he spoke with the quiet certainty of a mission commander laying out the plan of attack. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low and steady, "you don't have to fight alone. I'm there. Everyone who was here tonight is there. Whatever happens, we will face it together, just like we always have." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and heavy. It was an old, brass military lensatic compass, the kind you learn to trust with your life in the field. It was scuffed and worn, the markings faint from years of use. "This was my grandfather's," he said, placing it in my hand. "It got him through Normandy. I'm not giving it to you because I think you'll get lost." He smiled faintly. "I'm giving it to you to remind you that even when the storm hits and you can't see a foot in front of your face, you will always know your true north." Later that night, long after Mark had fallen asleep, I sat in the quiet of our living room. I retrieved a small carved wooden box from my closet shelf. It was the only thing I had taken from my childhood home, a box filled with my mother's keepsakes. I lifted the lid, the faint scent of dried roses and old paper rising to meet me. Inside, beneath a pressed flower and a few faded photographs, was her last letter. She had written it a month before she died, her handwriting shaky but clear. It was filled with love and quiet encouragement, but it was the final lines I sought. She had ended it with a quote from the Bible, a verse she told me had given her strength throughout her life. My fingers traced the familiar words on the thin, almost transparent paper. Joshua 1:9. "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Reading those words, a profound sense of peace settled over me. This battle wasn't new. My mother had been fighting it her entire life, a quiet, dignified war of resistance against my father's suffocating control. She had been preparing me for this moment all along. I wasn't just a daughter rebelling against her father. I was a soldier carrying on the legacy of a fallen comrade. We all have someone like that, don't we? A person living or gone, whose memory or words become our armor. A parent, a grandparent, a mentor, a friend. If you have a person like that in your life, I want you to honor them right now. Just comment with their first name or their role in your life below. Let's fill the comments with the names of the people who make us strong. The next morning, I woke before dawn. There was no team of bridesmaids, no frantic energy. There was only me and my mission. I began the ritual of preparation. It was a process I knew intimately, one I had performed countless times in the dim light of tents and barracks. I started with the uniform, the fabric crisp and perfectly pressed. I fastened each brass button, the movements precise and automatic. I straightened the jacket, ensuring every line was perfect. Then came the medals. I pinned each one to my chest, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. Each one was a story. The Army Commendation Medal, the Iraq Campaign Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, and finally, the Bronze Star. My father's silly pieces of metal. To me, they were entries in my own ledger, a record of loyalty, sacrifice, and courage. They were not decorations. They were my flesh and blood. They were my armor. When I was done, I stood before the full-length mirror. I had placed the old compass Mark had given me on the dresser, next to a small framed photo of my mother. My talismans. I looked at my reflection. I didn't see a bride. I saw a captain in the United States Army, fully prepared, her armor in place. And I was ready for the most important mission of my life. The moment the heavy oak doors of St. Michael's Cathedral swung open, a hushed silence fell over the pews. The rich, resonant chords of the pipe organ began to swell, filling the cavernous space. But I barely heard it. My eyes were fixed on the end of the long crimson-carpeted aisle where Mark stood waiting. And then, my heart stopped. Stepping out from the front pew, my father moved to the center of the aisle, positioning himself directly in my path. He wasn't waiting to give me away. He was waiting to stop me. He stood there, broad-shouldered in his tailored Tom Ford suit, a human wall between me and my future, a final gatekeeper. For a split second, the conditioned reflex of a lifetime took over. A tremor of fear, cold and sharp, shot through me. My shoulders tensed, my breath caught in my throat. I felt an instinctual urge to flinch, to retreat, to become small, just as the little girl inside me had been trained to do for nearly 3 decades. But then, I felt it. On either side of me, my escorts, 2 hardened rangers from Mark's unit, men who had walked through hell and back, imperceptibly squared their shoulders. It wasn't an aggressive move. It was a signal, a silent, steadying pressure that communicated a simple, powerful message without a single word. We are here. We have your 6. That was all I needed. I took the first step. That aisle was the longest I have ever walked. It wasn't measured in feet, but in memories. Each step I took was a journey back through the map of my own private war zone, the landscape of my father's disapproval. The first step took me back to Thanksgiving, to the suffocating silence of the dining room as I stood there at 17, a statewide science champion. I could see the heavy, leather-bound ledger open on the polished mahogany table. I could feel the weight of my family's eyes on me, and I could see my father's hand holding his gold Mont Blanc pen. As he wrote that big, bold, damning number next to my achievement, 000 euros. The sound of my brother David's triumphant smirk was louder than any applause I had received. The next step took me to a dusty, sun-baked mailroom in Baghdad. I was holding the stiff, corporate envelope from Allen Industries. I felt that flicker of foolish hope again, the one I could never seem to extinguish, the hope that this time would be different. Then, the feeling of the 4 neat squares of my own letter falling from the envelope into my hand. My heart, my explanation, my pride, torn into pieces and sent back across the world without a single word of reply. A dismissal colder and more final than any argument. With another step, I was back in my small apartment at Fort Hood. The phone pressed hard against my ear. It was just a few months ago, after I told him I would be wearing my uniform to the wedding. His voice, a low growl of controlled fury, echoed in my memory. "You will not embarrass this family with that ridiculous costume," he'd said. "You look like a common grunt, a piece of government property, a goddamn disgrace." The words he used weren't just insults. They were designed to strip me of my identity, to reduce my life's work to rags. He began to speak then, his voice booming through the holy silence of the cathedral, overpowering the gentle notes of the organ. He didn't shout, not yet. He spoke with the measured cadence of a CEO delivering a final verdict on a failed investment. He spoke of shame, of disrespect, of a daughter's duty. He spoke of family honor, but he meant corporate reputation. For a terrifying moment, I felt myself shrinking. The captain began to fade, and the little girl, desperate for a kind word, for a single glance of approval, began to surface. I felt weak, exposed, my armor of metals and rank suddenly feeling as flimsy as paper. I was that 17-year-old girl again, standing before the ledger, waiting for my value to be declared non-existent. And then, another voice cut through the noise in my head. It was quiet, gravelly, and steady. It was a voice I had first heard in the middle of a 36-hour training exercise, a voice that had pulled me back from the brink of collapse. It wasn't my voice. It was the voice of Drill Sergeant Barnes. "Pain is temporary, Captain. But honor is forever." The words were a shield. They were simple, hard, and true. They were forged in a crucible my father could never comprehend. That voice, the voice of a man who had tested my limits and found them worthy, was louder than my father's roar. It was the voice of my true inheritance. My father raised his hand. Time slowed to a crawl. The air grew thick. The scattered gasps from the guests seemed to hang suspended in the air. I saw the movement, the beginning of the arc, the same hand that had once taught me how to ride a bike now coming to strike me down. But I didn't look at the hand. I refused to give it power. I looked past my father, past the architect of my pain, and I fixed my gaze on the end of the aisle. I looked at Mark. He was standing perfectly still at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back. And on his face, I saw no pity. There was no fear, no panicked urge to rush forward and save me. There was only absolute, unwavering trust. His eyes were not looking at a victim. He was looking at his partner, at a fellow commander, and he was trusting me to handle my sector of the battle. And in that infinitesimal space between a hand being raised and a blow being struck, I realized this wasn't an attack. It was a choice. A final, definitive choice laid bare before God and 280 witnesses. Who was I going to be in the instant after this moment passed? Would I be Richard Allen's broken daughter, the one who finally crumbled under his rage? Or would I be Captain Demi Allen, United States Army? A commander never flinches. A commander holds the line. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and prepared to meet the impact, not as a punishment, but as my final, bloody, glorious liberation. I held my ground, my chin high, my body braced for the impact. The sting of the slap never came. In the space between heartbeats, Mark moved. He wasn't loud or aggressive. He moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of a soldier trained for war. He didn't touch my father. He didn't have to. He simply stepped between us, a human shield, his body a solid, immovable barrier. He looked my father directly in the eye, and that simple act of defiance held more menace than any shouted threat. Then he turned his head slightly toward me, his voice cutting through the suffocating tension, loud enough for the front rows to hear clearly. "Captain, do you require medical assistance?" My father, enraged at being thwarted, opened his mouth to roar again. But Mark raised a hand, a gesture of absolute authority that stopped him cold. Mark's voice was no longer that of a son-in-law. It was the clear, precise tone of an officer reporting an incident. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the stunned cathedral, "please remain calm. An assault on a commissioned officer of the United States Army has just occurred. Please remain in your seats." The air turned electric. He had just changed the entire context of the event. But the real coup de grace, the move that shattered my father's world, came from a place he never could have anticipated. From the third pew, an elderly man with a chest full of ribbons and 4 silver stars gleaming on the shoulders of his dress uniform rose to his feet. It was General Matthews, a living legend in the Army, a man who had commanded divisions in Desert Storm. He was Mark's guest, a mentor from his early days. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, a deep and powerful baritone honed by decades of command, rolled through the sacred space like thunder. "Attention!" It was the highest command. It was not a request. It was an order that every soldier, active or retired, has ingrained in their very DNA. The response was instantaneous. It was breathtaking. Throughout the cathedral, a sound like a single, sharp crack echoed off the stone walls. It was the sound of dozens of pairs of heels snapping together in perfect, synchronized unison. Every service member in the room, the young rangers, the seasoned colonels, the decorated generals, the quiet veterans scattered among the pews, rose as one. They didn't just stand up. They executed a flawless military maneuver. Their backs went ramrod straight. Their chins went up. Their eyes were locked forward. They formed a living, breathing wall of honor, a silent, blue and gold phalanx that surrounded and shielded me. They did not look at my father. They looked straight ahead, their collective gaze fixed on some distant point of duty. It was the most profound act of condemnation I had ever witnessed. A dismissal so complete, so absolute, it was more terrifying than any accusation. They had, in that single, unified motion, erased him from the battlefield. My father stood there, stunned into silence. His face, which had been contorted with rage, was now a mask of utter disbelief. The power dynamic had shifted so violently it had given him whiplash. He looked around, his eyes desperately searching for his own allies, for his own army. He turned to his kings, the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, the slick politicians, the members of his board. He had invited them here to witness his power, to see the Allen dynasty in all its glory. But they were not looking at him with support. They were looking at him with the cold, calculating eyes of risk assessors. They were kings in their own right, and they understood the unspoken laws of power. You must always, always remain in control. Richard Allen, in his blind rage, had just committed the ultimate sin. He had lost control in the most public way imaginable. He had attacked a symbol, a uniformed officer, a daughter, a decorated soldier, that even they, in their cynical world, knew they were supposed to respect. He was no longer a powerful patriarch, he was a liability, a volatile, unpredictable asset, a bad investment. His peers' judgment was silent, but it was final. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. He looked at his sons, my brothers David and Michael, but they wouldn't meet his eyes. They were staring intently at their own polished Italian leather shoes, suddenly fascinated by the intricate patterns on the Persian rug beneath their feet, wishing they could melt into the floor. They were his loyal lieutenants, but they would not go down with a captain who had just scuttled his own ship. Richard Allen, the titan of industry, the man who moved skylines and bent politicians to his will, took an involuntary step back. He stumbled slightly on the altar step, the brief loss of balance a perfect metaphor for his complete collapse. No one spoke. The organ was silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning, a sound that now seemed to roar in the deafening silence. He turned, his shoulders slumped. He walked back down the aisle, not with the confident stride of a king leaving his court, but with the shuffling gait of a defeated man being expelled from the field of battle. His retreat was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, pathetic, soul-crushing surrender. The fall of his monument didn't end with a bang. It ended in a tomb of his own making, filled with a silence more damning than any scream. I watched him go, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing for him. Not anger, not pity, not sadness. Nothing. I turned my gaze forward, toward Mark, toward the altar, and did not look back. After my father's retreat, a profound silence once again settled over the cathedral. But this was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the dead, shocked stillness from before. This was a silence of reverence, of awe. I took a deep breath, the first truly steady breath I had taken since the doors opened, and walked the final few steps to the altar where Mark was waiting. He took my hand, his grip warm and solid, and together we turned to face the priest. Father Michael, an elderly man with kind eyes that had seen a lifetime of human joy and sorrow, did not immediately return to the liturgy. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests with a gentle wisdom. In our lives, he began, his voice calm and clear, resonating with a quiet authority that commanded more attention than my father's roars ever could. We are all called to fight battles. Some are fought in distant lands, in the dust and heat of conflict. And some, he paused, his eyes finding mine with a look of profound respect, are fought right here in the sanctuary of our own hearts. Today we have been witnesses to great courage, and now let us celebrate the love that courage protects. With those words, he reframed everything. He didn't dismiss the ugliness that had just transpired. He sanctified my struggle. He took what my father had intended as a family scandal and elevated it into a testament of strength. He gave my battle honor. As we turned to face each other to say our vows, every word took on a new, profound weight. When I looked at Mark and said the ancient words, to have and to hold, to love and to cherish, I wasn't just speaking to him. I was making a promise to myself, a vow to cherish the woman I'd fought so hard to become, to honor the captain who had refused to surrender her ground. I was signing a peace treaty, not with my father, but with myself. And when Mark spoke his vows, his voice steady and sure as he promised to honor and protect me, Every person in that church knew it wasn't just a line from a script. It was a solemn oath he had already proven in action. The entire cathedral, my true family, had borne witness to it. Our vows weren't just spoken, they were ratified. The reception that followed was held in a beautiful old Texas ballroom with high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. It felt a world away from the tension of the ceremony. My brothers, David and Michael, hovered awkwardly in a far corner of the room, nursing glasses of expensive scotch, avoiding eye contact with everyone. They looked like defeated generals, unsure of their place in this new world order. Finally, David approached me, his tie slightly loosened, his usual arrogance replaced by a nervous energy. I braced myself for an apology, a confrontation, anything with a sliver of genuine emotion. I should have known better. "Well, you've really made a mess of things, Demi," he muttered, not looking me in the eye. "Allen Industries stock is probably going to take a hit on Monday after this little scene. Dad's reputation is everything." I looked at him, at his perfectly tailored suit, his worried expression that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with money. And I felt nothing. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was a hollow, echoing pity. He was a prince of an empire I no longer had any allegiance to, speaking a language of profit and loss that was now foreign to me. "That's your empire, David," I said, my voice soft but clear. "Not mine." And with that, I turned my back on him, a final, quiet act of secession, and walked away. Later, it was time for our first dance. The band leader approached Mark, expecting a request for a slow, romantic ballad. Mark leaned in and whispered something to him. The band leader's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he nodded and returned to the stage. The opening chords that rang out were not a gentle waltz. It was the raw, defiant, iconic guitar riff of Creedence Clearwater Revival's "Fortunate Son." A grin spread across Mark's face as he led me to the dance floor. The song was a classic anti-war anthem, a protest song beloved by soldiers for its unvarnished truth about class and privilege. It was our song, a song about those who serve versus those who profit. It was the story of my life set to a rock and roll beat. Our friends, our true family, understood instantly. They formed a circle around us, not as spectators, but as participants. They weren't just watching a bride and groom, they were surrounding two of their own. We danced in the middle of that circle of honor, laughing, liberated, and free. It wasn't the first dance of a newly married couple. It was the victory dance of survivors, of soldiers who had won their war and finally come home. That night, after the last of the guests had departed and a soft quiet had settled over the house, Mark and I stood on the small balcony of our hotel room, looking out at the glittering lights of the city. The air was cool and clean. He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, his chin resting gently on my shoulder. We stood there in a comfortable silence for a long time, just breathing together. "Does it hurt?" he asked softly, his thumb gently stroking my arm. My hand went to my cheek, to the place where the slap had landed, where a faint phantom sting still seemed to echo. I felt the smooth, unbroken skin. Then, my hand moved down, resting over my heart. I thought of the 30 years of slights, of dismissals, of being told my worth was zero. I felt the steady, calm rhythm beneath my palm. And I knew the war was finally, truly over. "Not anymore," I whispered, and I meant it for both places. The wound on the surface and the wound that had festered deep inside for nearly 3 decades had finally, miraculously, healed at the exact same moment. A few months later, a large flat package arrived at our new home. It was heavy and professionally wrapped, with no return address. Curious, Mark and I carefully opened it on the living room floor. Inside was a large, beautifully framed photograph. My breath caught in my throat. It was a picture taken from the church balcony, a wide shot capturing the exact moment the soldiers had risen to their feet. It was all there. The perfect, rigid lines of uniformed officers, their backs straight, their gazes fixed forward. In the center of it all was me, a lone figure in my dress blues, shielded and protected by this silent, magnificent wall of honor. Off to the side, almost an afterthought, you could see the blurred figure of my father, isolated and irrelevant. My eyes welled up with tears. Our friends had secretly arranged for one of the wedding photographers to capture that moment. Bolted to the bottom of the rich, dark wood frame was a simple, polished brass plaque. The engraving was elegant and clear. It read, "Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who stand up with you." We hung the photograph in the most prominent place in our home, right in the center of the main wall of our living room. It was our first and only family portrait. And it was perfect. A year to the day after the wedding, on the anniversary of my mother's passing, I drove out to the small, quiet cemetery where she was buried. The Texas sun was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees. I didn't cry. The grief I had carried for so long had been replaced by a sense of peace, of continuity. I sat down on the grass beside her simple headstone and pulled a letter from my bag. "Hi, Mom," I began, my voice clear and steady in the quiet air as I read the words I had written. "It's me. A lot has happened this year. I just wanted to let you know. I finally did it. I built my own legacy. It's not made of brick and mortar, Mom. It's not measured in square feet or stock prices. It's built on a foundation of honor. It's held together by the mortar of loyalty. And it's sheltered by a love so strong it can face down any storm. It's smaller than Dad's empire for sure, but it's real. And it's mine. You told me not to let him buy my soul. I didn't. I held on to what was true, even when no one else was clapping. I hope you're proud." I folded the letter, a sense of completion washing over me. I didn't need an answer. I could feel it. The story ends here, but my mission continues. A few years later, now a major in the Army, I was asked to speak to a group of newly commissioned female officers, young women about to take on their first leadership roles. They sat before me, their faces young, eager, and full of the same mix of confidence and fear I once knew so well. I didn't tell them the story of my wedding. I didn't need to. The lessons were more important than the events. I looked out at those bright, determined faces, the future leaders of our Army, and I left them with the most important piece of intelligence I have ever gathered. "People will try to tell you what you are worth," I said, my voice ringing with a conviction forged in fire. "They will put a price tag on your dreams. They will try to fit you into a column on their ledger. Do not ever believe them. Your value, your legacy, is not defined by their applause. It is defined by your actions when no one is watching. It's defined by the integrity you maintain when you are tested. And it is defined by how you stand your ground when the entire world is telling you to fall back." I looked at each and every one of them, pouring all the strength my mother gave me, all the honor the Army taught me, and all the love Mark showed me into my final words. "So go out there and build your own empire." That's my story. It's proof that a legacy isn't something you inherit, it's something you build, one act of courage at a time. I know I'm not alone, and that many of you have fought your own battles to define your own worth. Your stories are the reason this channel exists. If you believe in the power of resilience, please subscribe and become part of our community. Like this story if it touched you, and share it with one person who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Finally, comment below with one word that defines the empire you are building.